Well, good morning, colleagues. I'd like to welcome you all back to this meeting. This is meeting number 12, and pursuant to Standing Order 1083-HI, this is another meeting on the study of the Access to Information Act. And we are very privileged today to have with us for the full 2 hours the Honourable Scott Bryson, President of the Treasury Board, and accompanying him is Ms. Jennifer Dawson, who is the Deputy CIO. We will have an opening set of comments from the Minister. Minister, we have the full 2 hours, so usually we keep it around 10 minutes, but if you need a little more time, I think that's more than fine. And we will then go around the room and go through questions until everybody is satisfied, and we thank you very much for making yourself available on this very, very important study. So, Mr. Minister, welcome, and we'll start with your opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and also want to welcome our Parliamentary Secretary, Joyce Murray, and all of you committee members. On June 2nd, it'll be my 19th anniversary as a Member of Parliament, and over that 19 years, I will have at that point spent about 2 years in government and the rest in opposition, and I've been on committees of Parliament for 17 of those years, and I tell you it is from that perspective that I value the important work done by committees of Parliament, and we intend on fortifying the roles of committees and of parliamentarians as we work on legislation and consult with Canadians, and I thank you for the important work you do on this committee. I'm pleased to be here with Jennifer, our Deputy Chief Information Officer, to speak with you about access to information reform. J'aimerais remercier les membres de ce comité.
I'd like to thank the members of this committee for their proactive approach to exploring the Access to Information Act and for offering solutions to make it serve Canadians better.
This act is out of date. It hasn't been updated significantly since receiving royal assent back in 1983. This is incredible given how much Canada has changed, particularly in terms of the changes in terms of how information and data is produced, stored, and shared. All those areas have been revolutionized. Email, social networks, and smartphones rule the day today, and we need to modernize ETHI to reflect these realities. We also must change the culture around government information. We need to move towards a culture of open by default when it comes to information. Our Prime Minister has recognized that for a long time. In opposition, he actually tabled a private member's bill, C-613, to help modernize the Act. And during the campaign, our platform made commitments in terms of modernizing the Act. And these were actually reflected in my mandate letter, which, as you're aware, has been made public, as have all the mandate letters of ministers. In my mandate letter, the Prime Minister asked me to, quote, work with the Justice Minister to enhance the openness of government, including leading a review of the Access to Information Act, to ensure that Canadians have easier access to their own personal information, that the Information Commissioner is empowered to order government information be released, and that the Act applies appropriately to the Prime Minister's and Ministers' offices, as well as to administrative institutions that support Parliament and the courts. Now that we're in government, we're acting on these commitments to strengthen and revitalize access to information. Later today, I am issuing an interim directive on the administration of the Access to Information Act. And I'd like to begin by speaking to you today about some of the immediate changes we would like to implement and intend on today. This directive is guided by the principle that government information belongs to the people, and it serves and should be open by default. Elle guide les institutions.
It guides the institutions on how to administer the Act in ways that are consistent with our commitments to more open government.
It emphasizes that government information belongs to the people, and the directive stresses that providing access to government information is paramount to serving the public interest. It enables public debate on the conduct of government institutions and strengthens the accountability of government to its citizens and indeed the role of citizens and indeed the role of parliamentarians. The interim directive stipulates that from this moment forward, or from today forward, all fees apart from the $5 application fee will be waived. When feasible, requesters will receive information in the format of their choice, including open and reusable and shareable formats. Ces mesures concrètes nous
These concrete measures make early progress on our commitments.
but this is just the beginning. We are also moving forward with a two-step legislative plan that I announced recently. We split the legislative reform into two phases and issued a directive right away, specifically so that we could make improvements to the Access to Information Act immediately. Next, we will table legislation that will include the implementation of the rest of our platform commitments. And we also will bring forward significant improvements identified through public consultations and indeed through the work of this committee. These measures will shed more light than ever before on the government. One, we will give the Information Commissioner the power to the power to order the release of government information. Two, we will ensure the Act applies appropriately to the Prime Minister's and Ministers' offices as well as administrative institutions that support Parliament and the courts. Three, we will implement a mandatory 5-year review starting in this mandate to ensure that the Act stays up to date and consistent with modern needs and technology. Four, we will improve response times by addressing the problem of frivolous and vexatious requests to ensure that the purpose of the Act is respected. Five, we will improve performance reporting. We want to make sure that evidence guides our decision and that we can measure results. Voilà des changements importants.
These are significant changes. Take, for example, expanding the application of the Act to ministers' offices. For the first time, citizens will have an expanded view into the decisions of their governments.
This is significant reform which will involve every department, every minister's office, the Prime Minister's office, the courts, the Information Commissioner's office, and of course this committee. We are engaging with Canadians and Parliament because we need to get this right, and as we work to develop the proposed legislation. Your committee's input will be important to this process, and I particularly value the committee's advice on how to proceed on some of the government's commitments, and I would like to address a few of those. One is, what is the best approach to enable the Information Commissioner to order the release of government records? And what are the implications for the Commissioner's other responsibilities? Two, what special considerations would need to be taken into account in extending access to information to the Prime Minister's office, ministers' offices, and administrative institutions that support Parliament and the courts? And how can those considerations be addressed? Three, we've now eliminated all fees but the basic $5 administrative fee. But we need to filter vexatious and frivolous requests if we want to make the system timely and efficient. Question for this committee, is the $5 fee the best way to do that, or is there a better way? And I know there's been witness testimony on different approaches to this, and I'm looking forward to hearing your views and ultimately through your report informed by witnesses what some of your ideas in terms of the best way forward on this. Another question is, would the public interest be best served by allowing institutions and the Information Commissioner discretion to not process access to information requests or complaints that are frivolous or vexatious? And how would that be determined? Another question, how should we assess performance of the Access to Information program? Because ongoing measurement of the performance of it is important so that we understand how this is working from a results perspective. These are important questions, and once we've completed our consultations, we intend to introduce legislation in late 2016 and early 2017. And again, I stress that the work of this committee is important as it will inform our crafting of this legislation. The second step of updating the ETHI legislation is to launch a full legislative review, which will begin immediately after the first phase of legislative changes and will be completed sometime in 2018. This mandatory 5-year review will guarantee that no government in the future can allow the Access to Information Act to become as outdated and out of touch as it currently is. It will provide a more in-depth assessment of how we can continue to build on the changes we've introduced and whether those changes are meeting their objective of better serving Canadians. Some have asked, why are we waiting until 2018 for the full review? Well, it's very simply, we want to understand how the first round of legislative changes are working. We want to better understand those changes and how they're working before the full legislative review, the first of reviews that will occur every 5 years after that. Colleagues, I want to reiterate that these proposed reforms are just the beginning. We're committed to more open and transparent government. Our budget reinforced that commitment with specific investments, including doubling existing resources to open government initiatives, $11.5 million over 5 years for Treasury Board Secretariat's open government activities, $12.9 million over 5 years to enhance Canada's access to government information, including their own Canadians' own personal information. These are important investments in open government. L'avenir au gouvernement.
Open and transparent government, one that shares more information and data, is the way forward. If citizens understand why their government takes a particular course of action, if they have been engaged from the beginning, and if they have the same access to the same to the same information, they'll have more confidence in the outcomes.
Information we as legislators and as members of government have as we make decisions is simple, that we believe in the collective wisdom of Canadians, and engaging them early means that better decisions can result from more open engagement, and that those decisions will also co-emerge with more public support because the public's been engaged from the beginning, as has Parliament. Canadians have waited a long time to have their access to information regime modernized to meet current needs. I look forward to working with this committee. Your input and advice on how we can make improvements to the system is of great value, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. We appreciate it very, very much. We look forward to going through this process with you as the committee. And we'll proceed to our questions right now. We have a 7-minute round for the first 4 questioners, and we'll start with Mr. Lightbound.
Yes. So thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here today with us. So my first question, I'll start with what you just mentioned about the budget. I'll do it before Mr. Généreux does, because I'm sure he will talk about the budget. You've mentioned that in the 2016 budget, there's $11.5 million over 5 years for the Treasury Board and $12.9 over 5 years to enhance the government's open government ambitions. So I was wondering if you could tell us maybe a little more concretely how that's going to help the government to try to achieve a more open government, and how the money is going to be used. Also, is it sufficient in your mind?
Well, I believe, well, first of all, investments in technology and human resources are key to this. These investments over the next 5 years will help. It's also, one of the things that we are at Treasury Board as a central agency, we reach into every department and agency and have relationships across the Government of Canada. So part of what we do on an ongoing basis is evaluate the capacity of any department and agency to, for instance, comply with central mandates of the government, including as we move forward to modernize access to information. So one of the things we intend on doing is work closely with all departments and agencies to ensure that we have the resources in place and the people in place to meet our commitment to open government as the Access to Information Law changes. This is extremely important. It's a significant change. And I want to be the first to tell this committee that as you make significant changes, there will always be challenges, and the only way to avoid challenges or potentially even errors in implementation is to do nothing. We intend on making significant changes, and we'll do our darndest to get it right. But as we move forward, we're going to encourage public servants in departments to take intelligent risks and to make good decisions. But we understand the gravity of what we're seeking to achieve.
My other question for you, Mr. Minister, we've heard from Professor Drapeau from the University of Ottawa, who's talked about the role of ETHI coordinators who deal with the bulk of the access to information demands within each department. So I was wondering, he mentioned in his remarks here that ETHI coordinators need the status, independence, and authority which would flow from a governor and council appointment. So that was his recommendation. We've had other witnesses who disagreed with Mr. Drapeau. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what could be an improved role for ETHI coordinators.
I'd be interested in the committee's views on that. I can say as a minister that the practice ETHI coordinators within departments are independent. Ministers' offices, the practice is not to communicate or engage with ETHI coordinators. That is the work of. They are independent, and decisions on ETHI requests, as an example, are made at the officials level and ought not be influenced by ministers or ministers' offices. So, my view is, as I understand now, that these officers are in fact independent as public servants, but I'm open to, and that can be one of the things you address in your report. And Jennifer, you may want to any additional.
Yeah, I would, from my perspective, I would say that ATIP coordinators definitely are facilitated in acting in an impartial manner. There's a limited delegation of discretion under the Act, and ATIP coordinators act in a manner that is distinct from the rest of the operations of the department. But again, in support of what the President has said, we're welcome to views of the committee, and that's something we can take a look at.
How much time do I have left? Oh, okay. My other question is regarding the timeline which you've outlined. I see that the full review will occur no later than 2018. So I was wondering, do you think this will leave enough time to see if the changes made to the legislation in 2017 are effective? If we start that review in 2008, well, no later than 2018, right after the changes have been made, the initial changes, will that leave enough time to really assess the efficiency of the first wave of changes?
It's a good question. I believe it will give us some time. Obviously, when you make significant changes, a longer period of observation and measurement of results and unintended consequences will give you more information. But we felt it was important to establish and implement the first review. And again, this is going to be a review that will occur every 5 years, regardless of whatever government is in place. Every 5 years there will be a mandatory review of access to information, which will prevent the situation that we're in now, and that is that an act in 1983 that hasn't been modernized since then. I mean, you think of it, 1983, K cars were hot. Well, to the extent the K cars ever were hot. But the point is, you weren't born.
I wasn't born.
Now, would you stop bragging? They have, but it just gives you an idea of Mr. Lightfoot wasn't even born at that point. But thanks for making me feel old here.
Anytime.
But this is we are in an absolutely digital world now, and fax machines were still a big deal back in 1983. So we never want to be in this place again, and I don't think we will. Well, I know we won't be if we get this right in terms of the ongoing review.
Okay, that pretty much wraps that up. As entertaining as that was becoming, we now move to Mr. Kelly for 7 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Minister, for coming to see us today. We really appreciate having you here, and I listened carefully to what you had to say, and I would agree with much of what you said, particularly the the necessity of modernizing this legislation. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. And while it was nice to hear the importance that in your speech you mentioned toward or the attention to value of committee work, and I think you said the fortification of committees and whatnot. However, I have to point out that you went on from there to announce a whole series of changes that you are making without the benefit of hearing a report from this committee. You mentioned that you are going to, well, it's in the budget, in fact, that you are going to an order-making model. You announced today that you are dispensing with all fees other than the $5 application fee. We have spent the last 11 or 12 meetings of this committee. Well, I guess no, we spent some of them on privacy, but we've spent a number of hours of committee time toward hearing witnesses that have given us expert opinion on what steps the government should take, and yet here we are being told what steps you're taking without having to deliver, being able to deliver our report, which will be out in June. We're working quickly and focusing our attention to this. So I'd like you to comment on how the process that's underway is actually one that reinforces the importance of committee work.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Pat. And this is one of the challenges of being in government, and you'll understand this because we're all politicians here. Before the election, the Prime Minister made commitments as part of a private member's bill. In our platform, we made commitments. In my mandate, those commitments are reflected. Now, if I didn't keep those, if our government didn't do that, I bet you dollars to donuts, you would say that we were breaking our promises.
Could have said you're waiting for the committee.
We're actually keeping our promises, but let me tell you, we are also committed to, and we've made a commitment to, evidence-based decision-making, which means that if you in this committee can help inform us as to ways we can improve on some of these measures, we will take your advice seriously, and I mean that. I've flagged one area today, for instance, removal of all fees except for the $5 one. I've watched, some of the, read some of the testimony of witnesses before this committee, and they've made some compelling cases in terms of different models on this. I've talked to the chair about, and he mentioned some of the Sweden's model in terms of some of this. You're doing important work here, and Pat, I take it very seriously. We as a government take it seriously. We don't view committees as branch plants of ministers' offices. You are here as important legislative vehicles to produce and to evaluate public policy. So I rest assured your work will feed into our legislation, but there are some commitments that we've made to Canadians to which we are absolutely committed, and that's important. But your work here can help strengthen those and improve those.
Well, I certainly hope so. I would have thought, though, that in terms of promises made and promises kept, that it would have only taken you a few more weeks to wait until this committee reports. So.
But keep in mind, you're right, and that's why I think the timing of this committee is excellent, because it's over the next several months that we will be able to benefit from the work of this committee and from other consultations, including with the Information Commissioner and her office, Privacy Commissioner and his office, and stakeholders and experts. So this committee is a vital part of that.
Okay. So, and I certainly not using this example, I'm not prejudicing the outcome of our report. We're going to weigh all of the evidence that we've heard from a variety of witnesses. But for example, Professor Drapeau made a very compelling, in my view, a very compelling presentation to this committee, where among other things, he suggested that, well, he didn't suggest, he said it quite explicitly, that, that the existing ombudsman model for access to information is the correct model, and that the failings and shortcomings of access to information, in his opinion, were owed more to misallocation of resources within the office and a pervasive culture of secrecy within government departments that transcend all governments that go back for decades. So, for example, were we to support that and recommend retaining the ombudsman model, you have already in your budget said that that's not what you're going to do. So how much weight will this committee carry when you make your decisions?
We will be guided by evidence, and that was Michel Drapeau, and I've known him for a long time. In fact, back to the late '90s when you and I first met, and he's an intelligent and sage person. Well, of course, we're going to look at what he has to say and what others say, but we will be interested in these views, and we'll be interested in your report, but not just your report, because I've been on these committees. Sometimes, I mean, the reports are good, but sometimes some of the witness testimony that doesn't necessarily make it into a report are also helpful, and you learn something through some of that testimony. So we intend on following both the report, but also the testimony that helps inform the report. And I go back to your work here is important, and it will help us as we determine how to move forward. We won't have the legislation ready to introduce until late this year or early next year. There will be plenty of time to review the work of this committee, and on an ongoing basis, when the legislation is tabled, it'll come to Parliament, and this committee will have an opportunity to go at it again.
Very, very true. Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. We'll now move to Mr. Blakey for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for being at the committee. I think one of the challenges for Canadians and for parliamentarians with the new government is trying to read the tea leaves, as it were, and get a sense for what they can trust government to follow through on, and where they ought to be skeptical and do the work of holding government to account. What we see even here today in the document is a directive to be open by default. That's something that the Prime Minister talked about before the last election and during. And I'm trying to square that with the Parliamentary Budget Officer's assessment of the information provided to him as part of the last budget, where he says that the government did not provide, as per past practice, detailed tables that identify the impact of changes to its adjustment to the private sector forecast. And so how is it that a culture that's open by default fails in this new context to provide information that heretofore had routinely been provided to the Parliamentary Budget Officer?
We have great respect for the work of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and the Department of Finance, when it provided, I believe it was a 2-year projection, they did so on the basis that we are in very volatile times. Much of our economy is dependent on commodity prices, which are, as we know, have gone through a remarkable drop in the last period. And as such, the Department of Finance felt that to provide projections, it was more realistic over a 2-year than over a 5-year. Now, but
am I to understand from that then that, because I take the point about volatility, am I to understand from that the department didn't make attempts to forecast past those 2 years?
The amount of information that provided, the 2-year, was based on, in terms of being able to provide with confidence projections for Canadians as part of the budget document, that 2 years made more sense. The fact is, though, we listened to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and the Department of Finance provided 5-year projections. We didn't argue with or quarrel with the Parliamentary Budget Officer. When that office raised that concern, the Department of Finance, the government, responded. So that's part of a dialogue. We're not going to get into fights with officers of Parliament. We won't agree on everything, but we will seek to respect their wishes. We did in this case. The other thing too, and I suspect you're going to mention that the Parliamentary Budget Officer also had very positive things to say about the government's practice now of projecting lapses. The Parliamentary Budget Officer thought that that was a significant step forward as well. As we move forward, and as we did in this case, we listened to the Parliamentary Budget Officer in terms of the 2-year projections, and Department of Finance, my colleague Minister Morneau, released up to the 5 years. So this is a dialogue.
Indeed, and one hates to curtail dialogue, but at the same time, I think part of the idea of a culture of open by default is to reduce the amount of dialogue and therefore the amount of time that it takes to get access to information. So, Canadians have dialogue all the time with government about access to information requests. Usually it's because they're not getting the information. So this is one of the rare cases where I think a reduction in dialogue is actually a sign of progress, because it means Canadians and parliamentarians, in this case the Parliamentary Budget Officer, is getting that information in the most timely way possible, which is the point of being open by default.
I broadly agree with you, by the way, that the more information we can put out there, the better, so that we're all dealing with the same information. I broadly agree with that.
My next question just has to do with the duty to document. I mean, one of the things that I think if there's virtue in acting quickly in a kind of interim sense, and I think there is, one of the things that I would have liked to have seen included in those interim measures is a duty to document, because in the meantime, we're potentially losing important information because it's not being written down. And I wonder why there isn't no provision for some kind of duty to document in this interim directive.
Well, actually, that would be something that could be addressed as part of the legislative changes. The first batch of legislative changes would be later this year and early next year. And there has been some expert testimony on duty to document and models in other places.
I guess my concern, and why I think it would be important to have some sort of provisionary directive, is because there's going to be a lot of time that passes between now and whenever some future ETHI reform bill passes. And in the meantime, there's activity happening in ministers' offices. I presume, I'm not in them, but I presume. And if that's not documented, then that's activity that people may not have access to.
There's policy that already exists within the government. But in terms of how we can strengthen that policy, that can be an area, to Mr. Kelly's point, in terms of what areas the committee can provide advice. That could be one of the areas where you can look at other models. And Jennifer may want to reflect on or provide some insight in terms of policy that exists now.
Yeah, so just to add to that, existing information management policies, so rather than access to information policies, do capture a requirement for employees to document decisions and decision-making processes. And part of that is also to assist in terms of audit trails and ensuring that there's a really solid record of how decisions are taken and when they are taken. So there is currently a policy requirement that does apply to public servants, although you won't find that language in the access to information that you might have reviewed.
One of the things you may look at is how we can strengthen that in terms of policy as part of legislation.
So, you've expressed an openness and in fact, perhaps a decision to move ahead with order-making powers for the Information Commissioner. I'm wondering if, as part of that, you are also intending to grant the Information Commissioner the power to review documents that have been deemed confidential under any number of secrecy provisions under the current Act, so that there is an independent third-party review of decisions about whether something is a cabinet confidence or not.
Yeah, and that distills down into the argument between exclusions and exemptions in terms of some of these things. And again, I mean, we're open to your views as a committee on this. There are different models with their strengths and weaknesses around this, exclusion versus exemption policy. I think, I mean, there are clear areas, security, national security issues, privacy issues among them. around where we would all agree where there has to be either an exemption or an exclusion depending on that. And the question is, to what extent can the Information Commissioner have access to, cabinet confidences and then discern from there, or whether there should be absolute exclusions in certain areas. In certain areas, as an example, around national security, I think there would be broad consensus that exclusions can make sense. But I mean, that again, there are different models, and the wheelhouse of this committee now is actually studying some of those. We would be interested. What I would ask, though, in terms of your advice, and I'm not trying to direct the work of the committee, but it'd be helpful to identify in terms of some of these models what you see as the strengths and the weaknesses, and put some real thought to that. And I do the researchers as well. In terms of the strengths and weaknesses of some of these models, a witness may say, "I really like this particular model," but the work of the committee and the library, as you look at them, what are the real strengths granularly, and what are the real weaknesses? That can help inform our thinking on it as well.
Thank you very much. We've well exceeded the time, but it was an important answer. And at the risk of interjecting on a question that a committee member had here, I'm going to my own personal interest in response to one of your in response to one of the questions, Ms. Dawson. You said there are policies, and Mr. Bryson, you said there are policies. I would be personally curious to actually get my hands on a copy, if that's possible, of a sample policy in one of the departments, if that's possible, to submit to the committee.
Yes, that's the policy on information management, and we can provide that.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Saini for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here, Ms. Dawson. Mr. Minister, I have a question for you. It's a question on timeliness as to responding to requests that are asked. We had the Swedish ambassador who came here, and he said that whenever a request is made to the Swedish government, they act upon it immediately. And in Ontario, the Information Commissioner has said that the average request takes about 40 days. And we had the Newfoundland Commissioner who came here, who said that they act upon requests within business days. So my question to you is, what do you feel, or what does the department feel would be the right sort of time frame? And this won't pertain to every request, because some requests will be more detailed than others, but on average, what do you think would be an ideal time frame to respond to information requests?
Well, again, I think Sweden and Finland were, the first to enact access to information regime going back. Mr. Lightbound talked about 1983 and the fact that he wasn't bored. I think my research is that Sweden was 1766 when they brought in access to information, so they're bound to have it pretty good by this point. But in terms of in Newfoundland, you're saying Sweden, I think we need to ensure, both in terms of technology and IT and resources, that we can respond quickly. This question of frivolous or vexatious requests is an important one, and I haven't. We're doing research now to determine to what extent these can impede what are considered legitimate. But we also don't want to prevent people who, broadly, there are people who may think that their request is absolutely significant, and we want to take every request seriously. But we are looking at ways to improve service. Part of it will be resources. To ensure that departments broadly and access to information have the resources they need, but part of it could be process as well. What are bottlenecks in the process now that are preventing us from acting more quickly? That's something that we're looking at now, and Jennifer may want to comment on that, but we are looking at where there may be bottlenecks that are unnecessary.
Yeah, and in terms of the timeframes, what I can provide by way of context is that currently over 60%, or in that range, of requests are being met within the existing 30-day time limit. So we're obviously wanting to improve performance against the time limit that exists today. I think that something that the committee may wish to consider is what would be the implication of changing the time limit in terms of those performance standards, and what would be required as an investment if one were to set a more ambitious timeline.
My follow-up question is, you mentioned in your opening comments about government open by default, and my worry is that if you do that, then you're also going to have international requests for information, and we can get to the $5 fee later, but my sort of worry is that because you have a regime that is funded by the Canadian taxpayer, that is in place for the benefit of the Canadian taxpayer or the Canadian public, that you may be inundated with certain requests from outside the country. And how do we prioritize that Canadian requests will be met and not caught up in a backlog? Or how do we differentiate or prioritize that Canadian requests made by Canadians would be met in a certain time frame, and that international requests would also be met? But how do how are you going to proportionate how these things are met?
Well, I know Sweden's treats requests, I think, the same, whether they're international or domestic. My instinct, and this is just my instinct, is that our priority will be citizens of Canada in terms of providing them, and particularly as we develop this, as there will be inevitable challenges in implementation. As I've learned, both as a former Minister of Public Works and now at Treasury Board, implementation is always the challenge. My instinct is that we would focus on Canadian citizens first. But let's be clear, with open data today, any information you provide to a citizen of Canada becomes available to, as the citizen wants to share it internationally or with anybody else digitally. So, but my instinct on this, and I'd be interested in the committee's views on this, would be initially at least to focus it on Canadian citizens. But there may be unintended consequences to that approach that I'm not aware of or haven't thought of.
Any time?
We still have a little over a minute.
Just a quick follow-up. You made the announcement that the only cost to accessing a request would be $5. From what I understand and from what testimony that has happened with other witnesses, they've said that the $5 to process that would be very onerous and would be actually a cost to the government. So in some jurisdictions, they have the $5, they've eliminated the $5 cost to access information, but they put a time frame on the amount of time that could be utilized to fulfill that request, whether it be 5 hours or 10 hours. What's your opinion on that? Should there be a hybrid of both? Should we stick to the $5 cost and allow it to be open-ended? Because you talked about a vexatious request, and somebody could just dump on the system and keep people busy for over a period of time. So should there be some sort of hybrid towards that, or do you feel that the $5 the cost is sufficient? I'm just worried about the system getting backed up.
Yeah. I indicated some openness on this question in my remarks for a reason, because my view on this has actually been informed by some of the testimony before this committee, and I'm interested in this. There is a difference of opinion around this. The theory is that the $5 represents a hurdle, and the hurdle that will prevent or help reduce some frivolous or vexatious requests. But there is a difference of opinion on that. The administrative cost of processing that is an interesting one as well. That being the case, IT, the capacity to process, through credit cards and that sort of thing, that has been reduced significantly in recent years. So this is one. I guess I asked the question because We have proposed one approach. That approach is part of a commitment we've made, so we take it very seriously, but we're also committed to evidence-based decision-making, and if there's a better way. The other thing to keep in mind is any of the changes we make as part of the first legislative changes, when there's a more comprehensive legislative review, if we find something is not optimal or not working well, this can be changed. It's legislation, which means from an evergreening perspective, legislation can always be updated and modernized at the very least every 5 years, but it can be modernized or updated before 5 years if in fact there was a compelling change to be made, or even without the legislation, there can be a directive issued by the government if we felt something is not working well or something could work better.
Okay, thank you. This is a great conversation we're having here. Mr. Genevieve, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Yes. Yes, and thank you, Minister. Thank you, Ms. Dawson, and thank you, Ms. Murray, for joining us here today and taking the time and your staff as well to come excuse me, to committee. You spoke at the beginning, Minister, about your fondness for committees and the work of committees, particularly when you're in opposition. Hope that we can send you back there in about 3.5 years and you can continue your opposition work on committees. However, with that being said, I do have a duty on my end, and I have about 5 minutes, 4.5 minutes to ask you questions, and I'll interrupt you if that's all right. It doesn't mean I don't like you. It's just because I have to get through a number of questions here. With that being said, the question that Mr. Lightbound referred to, and you've touched on somewhat, in the budget, page 208, you mentioned informed by consultations with Information Commissioner, stakeholder, and parliamentarians. That was March 27th. I wasn't consulted. Being a parliamentarian, I wasn't consulted. Perhaps the members on the other side of the table were consulted. We weren't. So that leads me to think that this was a plan going ahead all along. You've then made comments on April 6th, I believe, when you're speaking to the Canadian Open Dialogue Forum 2016, that you'll be appearing before this committee in the process because I believe parliamentarians who are elected to speak for Canadians should have a say in this. And then once we're informed by their consultations, the committee's advice will move forward to amend the Act. We've seen, as I just highlighted in the budget, that you're moving towards an order-making model. Without the advice of this committee to date, then in your comments there, again, not with the advice of the committee, you've now made some changes to the fees. Curious, you did reference your platform, which I happen to have in front of me here. There's one sentence, and nowhere does it indicate that we're going to an order-making model process. And even one step further, you say there's no fees, not just the $5 fees. So, if you could perhaps elaborate on some of this advice that you've received from stakeholders, from parliamentarians up to date.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. I can tell you, if you did send me back to opposition at some point in the future, I enjoyed my work on these committees and considered it valuable, and I hope you enjoy your time and view it as valuable as well. In our budget, I mean, we referred to, and part of this is not a new issue around access to information, and Parliament, particularly those of us who've been around. Mr. Calkin's been around a while. I've been around a while. These are long-standing issues. The Information Commissioner has, over a period of time, made her office their views clear. There is a body of information to feed into this. That doesn't obviate the need and the importance of the work being done by this committee. This is early in the process, and we will be taking the work of this committee, the report, but also other evidence or testimony to this committee seriously as we shape, and you can see in my mandate letters. But there are let's be clear, there are commitments we've made, both to Canadians, but also in terms of my mandate letters, that we take seriously. But there's an overriding, there is an overriding commitment in terms of evidence-based decision-making, and if you have some thoughts...
You can say that, Minister, that there's commitments made to Canadians, but nowhere is it indicated that the order-making model is where you were planning to move to. And quite frankly, we're working rather diligently here on the committee to determine if that was the right model. And yet, in the budget, it came forward saying that's what we plan to do. So that's essentially my point: is where was this made public to Canadians that this is what you're planning to do?
Sure. What model would you prefer to the order-making model?
Well, that's exactly why we're at this committee. That's exactly why we're sitting here studying it. We're bringing in experts from across the world, really, to come in and provide that advice. So to think that you just have gone and decided that this is the model that, or the Prime Minister has gone and decided this is the model that he prefers seems to have completely trumped a lot of the work that we're doing here on the committee.
Please don't assume that at all. We are intelligent enough to listen, and so your thoughts, shaped by the testimony you hear at this committee, will be helpful. And if there are better models, and if there are things we can do to strengthen our approach, I assure you, Mr. Jennifer, that we will take that advice seriously. So, and I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of what are some of the other models, or there are best practices potentially within Canada and other countries from which we can learn. But the overriding approach of our government is to listen and to take into account. We want to be guided by evidence, not ideology, and we would really appreciate the input of the committee and the people you're hearing from.
Okay, that uses up that particular round of time. Remind colleagues that we are in the 5-minute round, and we'll move to M. Massé. Vous avez 5 minutes.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, and thank you to the Minister for being here with us today. It's greatly appreciated. I know that your staff are working very hard on this and to make sure that you have all the information that you need, and so I'd also like to thank them for being here and supporting us in this work. Unlike what Mr. Généreux thinks, I think our platform was clear and we spoke about an order-making process. I can read from the platform.
Giving then, in my eyes, maybe I'm getting too old, giving them the power to issue binding order for disclosure. So, you know, and it was public, it was there. So, you know, I have no concern. And the Canadian, you know, I've read our platform and they made a clear decision on the 19th of October. So I'll switch back in French. My mind has been set up in English reading this. Vous nous avez annoncé ce matin.
This morning, you made a clear statement about the direction in which we'll be heading in, and I would like to hear a little bit more about this direction. Could you tell us more about how this is going to help increase access to information and do so quickly? Would you be able to expand on this a little? Answer. Well, firstly, I appreciate your question, and I understand that you have a lot of experience as in the public service. You've got a valuable perspective to offer to this committee for the work that we're doing. From now on, we're going to move towards a more open model, open by default. That requires a government cultural change, and so it's important to change policy. I announced some immediate changes, and I'm doing that this morning. We also have to listen, however. We have to listen to the Canadian public. We have to work very closely with the committee. So that when the time comes to prepare the legislation at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, we'll be able to incorporate these views, and we'll be able to table legislation and changes that will reflect this.
So these are, as we present those changes, the starting off, the changes immediately will help. But the first round of legislative changes, which will make the Access to Information Act apply appropriately to ministers' offices and prime ministers' offices, that's a significant step. Increased powers for the Information Commissioner is a significant step. Other changes that you identify as a committee, based on your work, can help inform that first round. But keep in mind that legislation will be back here in Parliament after it's introduced for the legislative review, and you're going to have another go at it. So there's an opportunity to do that work. But these are significant changes, and again, since 1983, Lightbound City wasn't even born back then, but this is a significant step forward. It's also, this is not a partisan issue, by the way. This is something that one of the things that I always enjoyed about committees when they worked well was that they're less partisan inherently than what goes on in the chamber of the House of Commons. And that's something that, on something as important to this, keep in mind, there will be governments of different stripes in the future, and some of you in opposition now may be parts of governments in the future. And, you know, it's with that perspective that this is an issue that's too important for partisan division. Like, this is something that's really important to get right for all of us. And I think that this committee is a good place to conduct that evaluation.
Merci.
Okay. Mr. Massey, I'm sorry that's very, yeah, we're there at the 5 minutes, but I'm sure we're going to have more time, and if you've got more questions, I'm sure we can come back. At the risk of feeling old, could you please stop bringing up Mr. Lightbound, Mr. Bryson? No, I'm kidding. All kidding aside. Yeah. Mr. General.
Okay, thank you. I guess something that maybe Mr. Lightbound might remember is that in 1990 and 2000, there was changes made to the Access Information Act. So it's not all date pre-Lightbound here, if we will. Just for a point of clarification. Hoping to get a kind of yes or no answer from a minister. Do you support giving the commissioners access to the cabinet confidential documents?
That is, you know, as we've said, ministers' offices and prime ministers' offices, we've said will be Access to Information Act will apply appropriately. In terms of cabinet confidences, would matters of national security, as an example, that may be discussed within a cabinet around, for instance, a terrorist threat, as an example, or classified information that is deemed top security clearance information. Personal information on Canadians. This is something the Privacy Commissioner has some views on. As an example, information that can move markets, you know, and some types of financial information and changes.
Certain ones you would be open to, and certain ones you wouldn't. Is that your position?
You know, this is the discussion between exclusion and exemption is one that I'm open to your input. You have judgment both. You've been a provincial legislator as well. This is something that there are different models, and even in Sweden, which has been cited to me as the as a, a very well evolved and comprehensive access to information regime, there are restrictions in place. For instance, the documents related to national security, central financial policy, supervisory activities of public authorities, and personal information. That's in Sweden. So I think there, you can see that there are reasonable limitations that people would understand.
You're a very experienced politician. So it was a very long yes or no answer, Minister.
You're pretty experienced
also,
too.
Thank you. You're also in the budget. You indicate 11.5 million over 5 years will be going to 2 departments for these changes. One of the major changes in front of us, which one of my colleagues on the other side indicated, is that it would be open to international customers. We had immigration here in front of us. We had a defense deputy in front of us, and both of them said that this would be huge. This would be difficult to manage under their current budget. So I'm curious as to indicating that only 11.5 is there. Is that now off the table, that we won't be pursuing the international requests?
Well, of the 11.5, significant part of informed about 9 million will be on website development, and 2 million developing capacity. There's also privacy issues to address as part of that from an IT perspective. We don't underestimate, and I take your point very seriously, enterprise-wide IT type solutions are tough for a company, they're tough for government. We know the challenges in the Auditor General's report on Shared Services Canada, that under the previous government, there are real challenges. And I'm not being partisan when I say under the previous government, because there's not a government that has not had challenges with enterprise-wide IT solutions. When I was Minister of Public Works, way back when, I still have some level of PTSD from my experience with IT procurement. This is a tough area. I agree with you that these investments are quite modest. And if we will use them prudently and respecting taxpayers and tax dollars. But we will also evaluate whether whether it's the right quantum of resources, both in terms of technology and people, to do what we're committing to.
And just one final comment. No. You mentioned the partisanness of the. It won't be a question, I promise, Chair. The partisanship of the committee. It was. We were working quite in a nonpartisan way until the budget came out, and when the budget came out, I think that kind of surprised a lot of us on this side of the table. So again, that's just a comment.
Okay, fair enough. Your time is up, Mr. Genereux.
I just want to give him every reassurance that we're open to your ideas and suggestions. So if that helps to get rid of any unnecessary partisanship, I'm glad I was able to help.
Appreciate you turning the temperature down on the boiling pot there, Mr. Minister. We'll now turn it over to Mr. Erskine-Smith.
So first, thank you, Minister, for attending today. I wanted to start by, in the notes I have before me, it says in 2014-15, federal institutions spent over $67 million in direct costs to administer the ETHI Act. That was for staff and business systems for processing. It doesn't include costs associated with business areas, searching for and reviewing documents. So I wonder first, do we assess the costs of folks reviewing and searching for documents? If, as an evidence-based decision-making government, are we trying to capture that time and the cost to government of that time?
Well, that would be a good, I'm the $60-some million figure I'm familiar with. That, by the way, the amount of fees we collect is pretty tiny compared to exactly about 300,000 compared with that. Jennifer may have some insight in terms of some of the other costs, because you've made a good point. You can't manage what you don't measure, and the degree to which we actually understand some of the less obvious costs really is important as we're making decisions. Jennifer?
Yeah, I would say that to date we have not tracked those costs outside of the direct processing costs. We have close to 70,000 requests annually, and so we haven't, as part of the tracking process associated to moving all of that material through, track the indirect costs associated to that.
Would we be able to be provided with a full breakdown of that $67 million?
Sorry, of the spending, the direct
Of the,
cost
yeah, the
spending?
direct cost, the $67 million. We could receive a full breakdown in this committee?
I'll see what I can provide, yes.
Thanks very much. Now, with respect to the timeline, so I understand we have an interim directive as of today. We're looking at a first phase of review, and Minister, you've identified certain changes within your mandate letter, but you're open to other changes. And then in 2018, there's going to be a larger consultation process that comes to fruition. I just wonder, I'm a backbencher. I'm very happy to see this government empower committees, and I'd like to I share Mr. Blakey's concern about acting as quickly as possible on a duty to document and some other items that are in Ms. Legault's report. And I wonder, we're going to get a report from this committee out in June, and ideally we're going to talk about a duty to document, extension rules requested by departments, extending the ETHI Act to other bodies, so not just the Minister's Office and Prime Minister's Office, but also to publicly funded bodies. And Ms. Legault has proposed changes in that regard, where a threshold of $5 million of funding, or over 50% of funding from now. We'll also make proposals with respect to exclusions or exemptions, with respect to sanctions, the duty to report destruction. The more that we put in that June report, the more I would like to see in that initial phase of changes. And so I wonder if you could comment whether, are you looking for around the edges changes and proposals to the first phase that you've identified and the changes you've already identified? How much can we pack into that first phase to actually get this done within our mandate?
Well, first of all, we starting immediately, we're doing some changes. I'm open to, I've laid out what our platform commitments, what our mandate commitments, and we're, if you have suggestions as to ways we can strengthen those, that's fine. If there are some other things we can move forward that could be part of the first phase of legislation, we would be interested in that. What we want to, part of the issuing the directive today was that we wanted to have some early deliverables to actually get some things done in the short term, as we're working to ensure that through the first phase of the legislative changes, late 2016, early 2017, we do the others. Those will be focused on what we've already proposed that can be strengthened and improved by the work of this committee. And if there are some other areas, for instance, in terms of the policy of information management within government now, that information is available to the committee. There may be things we can strengthen in terms of that practice now. And so that's something we'd be interested in.
I appreciate wanting to do a full conversation and or consultation in 2018. I would just note the Office of the Information Commissioner obviously did a fulsome consultation in advance of her recommendations. We're doing a consultation here, and Newfoundland, I would add, did a fulsome consultation before making their changes. And I spoke to the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, and they claim that's the gold standard in Canada. So I think we can look to already consultations that have occurred to make our changes. Thanks very much, Minister.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And we have Mr. Blakey left on our official rounds of questioning. And if any other colleagues would like to be put on the list, we'll simply move to ensure that every member of Parliament's privileges are respected and have an opportunity to ask questions. Mr. Blakey, for up to 3 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Je comprends dans mes communications.
Thank you. I understand from my communication with the Commissioner that they already have a backlog of 3,000 cases and that they receive some 2,000 complaints a year. You spoke about putting more resources into the Information Commissioner's office in the 2016 budget. Is this going to have an effect on the complaints getting handled? Answer. I met with the Commissioner recently, and we are going to continue discussing important questions about her work. And the matter of resources is one that is an important one. I take it seriously. And we are going to consider whether she has the necessary resources to do what she has to do. And so certainly that is an ongoing discussion with the Commissioner. For us, it's extremely important to ensure that she does have the resources she requires to do this important work.
Down to is, I mean, we've heard about the importance of the work of the Information Commissioner, and there are some other examples with the government. For instance, a lot of members expressing concern and support for expanded palliative care in Canada, but it's hard to square the idea that something is a priority of the government when it doesn't appear in the budget. I mean, how do you square those things? And when you were in opposition and you saw the previous government doing something like that, I mean, would you not have said at that time that if it doesn't appear in the budget and if there isn't money attached to commitments that require money in order to implement, that it's not a real priority of government?
I want to tell you, I was darn good in opposition, so I understand very much the role you're playing, and it's an important one as a challenge function to the government, and we want you to hold us to account. When you talk about palliative care, our health minister is working closely with the provincial governments. And one of the things with health care, it's a shared responsibility. We transfer funds, but we also want to work closely with the provincial governments. My understanding is that Manitoba has quite a strong home care policy, for instance, and I believe quite a well-developed palliative care policy, I believe.
We also have a history of NEP governments.
We have, well, there you go again. There you go again. But
I think
until recently.
Yeah.
But the point is that, Mr. Blake, if I may, one of the things I learned over a long time here is no party has a monopoly on values or the desire to serve Canadians well. So there have been good governments of all stripes, both provincially and federally, although there's one that hasn't yet had an opportunity federally. But the point is that there are good ideas, and I cited some. Manitoba, for instance, what you've done on immigration over the years. You've got a great model for immigration and something we can learn from in Atlantic Canada, and I cite the Manitoba model. I just want good ideas. I don't care what party comes. You might even have a good idea for us. I'm looking forward to it. I bet you do.
Well, if that's not the most optimistic thing I've heard all day at committee, then I don't know what is. Colleagues, we now are just going to move in the order in which, if it's okay with you, the order in which people indicated to me. So I have Mr. Kelly, then Mr. Bertina, then Mr. Long. So let's keep it all at about 5 minutes, and then we'll see what time we have left, and we'll go from there. Mr. General. Or sorry, Mr. Kelly.
Okay, well, thank you. And I was intrigued, and indeed, we don't want to be bogged down into partisanship, and I completely agree that the issues that are before us are not partisan. I frequently find myself agreeing and enjoying the thoughtful questions that my Liberal colleagues and Mr. Blakey ask. I also notice that sometimes in these matters, when a member of the government is confronted with either a question or facts that that make them uncomfortable, they mention partisanship and talk about the need for evidence-based decision making. Perhaps if you could, Mr. Minister, if you could address a question that Mr. Generou asked, and we talk about what evidence has guided these interim decisions. And also, could you make a commitment, if you're able to, that if this committee makes recommendations based on much of the evidence that we've collected from other provincial commissioners, for example, who think that privacy and access to information should be combined, or to reject the order-making model. If this committee makes such recommendations, will you reverse the decisions that you've already made?
We will consider the recommendations you're making. Keep in mind, any changes we make, it will only be in the application and the evaluation of the implementation and the results of those that we'll be able to fully evaluate. But we will be taking seriously all the recommendations of this committee. And if there are some recommendations that we look at and say, look, not just based on the recommendation, but on the testimony that contributed to those recommendations, maybe that approach is better. But we also have a reality that I have a mandate letter where there are certain key commitments we've made that have been based on a significant amount of research and work in building a platform and a mandate letter. I can tell you if there was something that I felt was compelling and changed my mind on some of this, I would certainly talk to our government, our Prime Minister, and say this is something. The one thing, politicians are sometimes attacked for changing their minds. They're always saying that he flip-flopped or something or whatever. The politicians that worry me are the ones who don't change their mind when they're faced with new facts or evidence. They're the scary ones. There should be nothing wrong with politicians who, when faced with the facts, change their minds. So when the facts change, I change my mind.
That would be refreshing, and perhaps many politicians lack the courage to admit that they've changed their mind, and they try to deny that they've flip-flopped.
How I even changed my parties.
Yes, indeed, and perhaps I don't know how the rest of my colleagues would feel if you wanted to come back, so we haven't talked actually about one of the key recommendations that many of the provincial experts have made to this committee, and that is whether the access to information and privacy ought to be handled by one commissioner. We also heard, and I know this goes to some of Mr. Erskine-Smith's comments about allocation of resources. These offices spend a lot of money on internal services, and we've also had the concern from Professor Drapeau about the misallocation of resources. Would you be open to combining those two offices should this committee recommend that? We've heard some strong recommendations in that direction.
There's an important tension in some ways between privacy and access to information, and a positive. I view that positively because, and I do think, and this is my instinct, not having had the benefit of all the testimony and your report, I do think having distinct offices, and it does have its advantages, but I'm interested in looking at other models. I mean, some of there will be times when the privacy commissioner will quarrel with what the information commissioner wants in a particular area, and but I'm interested in the best possible model. These are officers of Parliament. There are stakeholders with which to have these discussions, and the resource question, which was raised earlier, is an important one as well. So that we take all those questions seriously, and what is the best, the best approach. This will be valuable. I mean, do you see the benefit of having separate offices as well as do you see some of the benefits of separate offices?
We're collecting our evidence, and we haven't been through the process of making a final determination, but it was one that each of the provincial commissioners that we've heard as witnesses, and there's been much evidence by many witnesses to the strength of the Newfoundland and Labrador model, which as with the other commissioners is a single commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. We can come back. I think we're going to have more time. I'm just going to try and keep it at 5 minutes like we do for the second round. And just remind in this particular environment, well, we're all parliamentarians at the table. Usually it's the witnesses that are answering questions and it's the committee members that are asking them. Mr. Bryson, you have a 17-year history of being around the table asking questions,
I know.
So I'm sure that's a habit for you.
But I want to listen.
Yeah, but Mr. Bettina, for 5 minutes, please.
So on the notion of timelines in 1983 and where Mr. Lightbound was at the time, in 1965 I began my broadcasting career in Stratford. They handed me a tape recorder and said, go interview John Diefenbaker. And there was an election at the time, and I asked him a question, and his answer was, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. So I'll see if I learned anything in 50 years. Peter Moon was there from the Globe and Mail and said, sir, what are your views on education? He gave him a 10-minute answer. I learned. You ask simple questions. So, in recommendation 6.1, the Information Commissioner recommends that institutions be required to proactively publish information that is clearly of public interest. So, you're engaging with institutions right now and the public to determine what information is of public interest. Should the information that is proactively published be made accessible only to Canadians, and we talked about this earlier, or foreign civilians and institutions as well? But the question on that I have is this notion of public interest, because, you know, in this long broadcasting career, I was all through the Watergate stuff and what was of public interest. So what would you reflect on what is the public interest?
Thank you, Mr. Every time you speak with that baritone voice, I think you must have been a great broadcaster. That and also politician and municipally, and the Nixon White House isn't exactly our model that we're seeking, but the proactive. One of the things about proactive disclosure is that it actually cuts the administrative costs in some ways and the processes of access to information. And your chair mentioned that to me the other day, and it is true that the degree to which we put the information out there actually so that people don't have to go through a request process. Some of this has just happened technologically. When I was first elected in 1997, when I had a speech to write, I used to use the Library of Parliament. I used to do so many requests to the Library of Parliament to get information for a speech, right? Today, when I'm writing a speech at my house in Cheveree, Hants County, Nova Scotia, I go on Google and I Google the stuff, and I'm using the same internet search engine that some kid in grade 8 writing a paper is using. So there's been a democratization of information without any change in laws, right? So we're the ones, I'm talking government collectively, that have to catch up. I mean, I can, and you know, but one of the when you can, so this is just putting the information out there and determining what information. What I like about this, what technology has done in terms of democratized information and what we are seeking to augment in terms of modernizing access to information, is if you give the public and if you give parliamentarians as much information as possible, and it's as close as it can be to the information from which we're making decisions, I think there can be a convergence in terms of what the best ideas are, because we're guided by the same information. And the degree to which we eliminate that delta between the information that the decision makers have, say in a cabinet room, and the information that parliamentarians have or Canadians have, can create the opportunity for better decisions to co-emerge with more broad support. And so I'm actually quite excited about this.
I wanted to ask you, if I just have a moment, about in the report, striking the right balance for transparency, the Information Commissioner recommends various offenses and penalties for cases where the Act is being violated. Where would you be on the notion of penalties?
Well, there are penalties now, in fact. I just have a note here. Oh, where is that actually? I have a note. I had it, you know. Here it is. There's anyone who obstructs the Information Commissioner or in the performance of the Commissioner's duties or functions under the Act is guilty of an offense and liable upon summary conviction to a fine of $1,000. There's also other if you destroy or alter records or falsify or make false records, there are fines for that, maximum of $10,000. There are penalties currently. I'd be interested in how they compare with other jurisdictions. I haven't done all that research yet, but I'd be interested in that.
Thanks. I'll leave it at that. I'll pick that up later. Thanks.
Thank you. That was about 5 minutes anyway, Mr. Bertina, so I appreciate that very much. We'll move on to Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, Minister Bryson. Appreciate you being here today, and I just want to applaud you for your passion and conviction and certainly being a strong advocate for access to information. I think it's refreshing for all of us to see somebody as open and transparent and, forthright with answers as you've been for us, so I want to thank you for that. I guess I want to focus on a few things, and I think it was very nice to hear Commissioner Legault come out and say that, the government, she applauds us for our spirit of cooperation in certainly our early days, and I think that's a very positive thing. But I just want to focus on a few of her recommendations, and one of the things she suggests is the mandatory 5-year review. And I mean, that's going to allow basically every government, every mandate to have a review. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, why you feel that's important, and follow up to that, how you think the reviews should be and will be conducted.
Certainly, and we appreciate Commissioner Legault did say some positive things. From time to time, she won't agree with us, and we appreciate hearing from her when she doesn't agree with us as well. In terms of the 5-year review, we just don't want to get back to the same place we're in now, and that there hasn't been, and I take your point, there have been some changes, but there haven't been significant updates since 1983, and this is given the degree to which there's been a revolutionary in terms of digital and information technology since then. This is an area that needs, if anything, we think that we've been through a period of incredible change. The rapidity of change will only increase. So as we move forward, actually in ensuring a 5-year review, that doesn't mean that any government can or this committee can review and suggest amendments between those mandatory 5-year reviews. That just puts a stake in the ground.
Thank you. I didn't realize that you've been actually up here for, 18, 19 years?
19 years, June 2nd.
Oh, my, oh, my. I told my friends and my wife if I was over 8 to get the hook and pull me out, so congratulations.
This is a very seductive place, Mr. Long. When you get up here,
we'll see. It's different than hockey, I'll say that.
This is a place, I can tell you, and some of your new members, this, as exciting as Ottawa is, make sure you spend lots of time in your constituencies, and I wouldn't be here elected 7 times if I had been seduced totally by Ottawa. The people of Kings Hants know my commitment there, and work hard in your constituencies. Particularly, we've just had a 6 months, just the first 6 months, first year, the work your butt off in your constituencies. Really important stuff. That's gratuitous advice from somebody who's been around. Some would say too long.
Thanks for that, and thanks for the advice. I appreciate it.
That's right.
Seeing the fact that you've been up here for quite a while, and you've been through different governments and different parties, I think one prevailing thing that we've talked about, no matter what witness has been in, is about the culture and the culture of delay and the culture of secrecy, and we've been called as government laggards and so on and so forth, and recognizing that culture doesn't happen immediately, it happens over time, and culture certainly is something that can change with the proper leadership. Just how, in your opinion, has the culture of secrecy, the culture of delay developed? Why is it developed? And what have you seen? And when did it really take a sharp turn?
Look, I think every government gets elected with the best of intentions. And, what the test of a government is to remain true to those values. one of the things that and part of it is informed, my view of committees and the work of committees has been formed as somebody who served on committees for a long time, took the work seriously, and became frustrated sometimes. You know, we have, this is my 5th committee I've appeared before since becoming Treasury Board President, Senate and House. One of the things some of the toughest questions are actually asked sometimes by Liberal members, and I think that's a good thing. We don't provide as a government questions to governing members to ask us. We want to hear from them because you're legislators. You all have a responsibility. This is something that's in our Parliament. It's not just opposition members who have a responsibility to hold the government and the cabinet to account. It's government members, and not just in a caucus room at a committee. So this is valuable. But I think I don't want to be partisan in terms of there's a. I just want us to do the kinds of things that we that are consistent with what we've committed to, both in terms of specific commitments, but also broadly in terms of open and transparent government and trusting people, trusting Parliament and trusting citizens to help us inform the decisions we take as a government. I think we'll get better decisions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Long. That's about 5 minutes, which I'm trying to keep it to that. In fairness, every member of Parliament now has had an opportunity to ask questions. I still have Mr. Massey, who I think wanted one more follow-up question. Then I have Mr. Blakey, who, if you can keep it brief, because you've had well over 10 minutes already, and then go back to Mr. Generou for the same reason. But Ms. Murray, would you like to have? Okay, we can. If it's the will of the committee, I think there's nothing wrong with that. I do have something just anecdotally to add to the conversation that yourself and Mr. Long were having. I had a mayor in my constituency of a small village who I was very, very fond of, and I found out he wasn't running again, and I asked him why, and he said, well, politicians are like diapers. They should be changed regularly and often for the same reason. And keeping that in mind, we'll go to Mr.
Calkins, if I can respond to that. I've got twin daughters, 2 years old, and my day begins with doing exactly that. So,
but some of us end up stuck here, and that seems to be the way it goes. Mr. Massey, please.
J'avais une question supplémentaire.
Yes, I had a follow-up question, and I think it follows on from what Mr. Long was saying as well. There's a lot of talk about culture, where it's difficult to have access to information. The government is Canada's largest employer. There are many departments, many programs, and it's easy to imagine just how much information is within this organization. So have you thought about information management? It's all very well to want to give access to information, but you also have to make sure that you can actually get access to it in terms of information management. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. What could be done to facilitate information management? Answer. This is, again, not just a matter of changing the culture. You're right, we must also act. It also involves technology and how IT can play a role. There's the question of human resources as well. It's always difficult to implement change, especially when you're talking about change across the board. I gave the example of Shared Services Canada. That was certainly a big challenge for the previous government, and it's also a challenge for us as the current government.
For us, going forward, you've been a public servant. Pour nous, on a une fonction publique.
We have an exceptional public service here in Canada, and it's very important for a government like our government, with a very ambitious and progressive program. It's very important that we work well with the public service when it comes to implementing our programs. We have to restore a culture of respect, respect towards the public service, So there is a change in terms of cultural changes, but we also have to look at information technology, we also have to look at human resources, and all of that is built in a change of culture, a culture of respect towards the public service and a culture of openness, and of course a respect towards Parliament as well. All of this is important. Question. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the open by default model. This was raised in the discussions, and some witnesses suggested a one-stop shop, a portal where you could have access.
This is a good question. It goes back to my earlier conversation with Mr. Calkins briefly this week in terms of this. The more information we put in this, and Mr. Bertina mentioned as well, the more information we actually put out there, open by default, the lower the administrative burden in terms of ongoing. The other thing to keep in mind with this as well, I mean, open by default basically means the onus right now is on citizens to prove why they deserve to have the information. Open by default, the onus is on government to say why citizens don't deserve that information. And that's where we have to evaluate, you know, what are the reasons why something can't be out there, and I find it compelling, and again I ask the committee, to understand that as we move in this direction, it will take time, and we will err sometimes as we're doing this, because you can't make changes in government or business or any organization. You can't make significant changes without sometimes making mistakes. But I would rather us make mistakes and move forward with an agenda that is towards progressive and open, transparent government than to sit still. So on va essayer de faire des changements importants.
And that will allow us to make important changes to ensure we have a more open and more transparent government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blakey.
I guess I'll just start by reassuring the Minister that it's not my intention to be inappropriately partisan on committee, and humbly submit that sometimes when an exposition of fact is characterized or feels partisan, it can have as much to do with the partisan loyalties of the person hearing those facts than it does the partisan loyalties of those presenting them. Given that, I would say that just to put in historical context the sense of urgency that I feel about getting a duty to document within the kind of interim directive, that in 2006 a new government had been elected and had made a lot of noise about accountability and transparency in government, and had proposed at that time, or undertook once they were elected, to carry out that reform in a two-step process. They were going to bring in certain measures, and did, and there were some independent officers of Parliament created, and there was some activity, and then the second step never really came. In fact, things got significantly worse. And as a nonpartisan champion of access to information, and someone with great knowledge of the kind of institutional inertia of government, and given that historical example, would you not say that it is important on some of these things that have been well researched and consulted on at various levels within Canada and internationally, that we get a number of those important changes done as soon as possible, so that we don't end up in a similar situation where the follow-through on the larger reform doesn't happen because the culture of government either takes over or changes, depending on how you want to characterize it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blakey. Let me be clear. I am a partisan. I just suggested that the work of committees can be less partisan. I know you understand that, and I also know the role the partisanship plays in this, and that's not an entirely destructive one. There's a reason for that. You're suggesting that we're not moving fast enough. Mr. Kelly's suggesting we're moving too fast. And what I'm saying, it's like the three bears kind of thing. We're trying to get it just right. But in
Not Goldilocks in that analogy.
Not yet. But the fact is that we have made specific commitments. We're making some changes now. We've laid out a time frame within which we will implement specific and important changes. And you know, when I was in opposition, just leading up to the 2011 election, it was my motion that led to the government of the day ultimately being found in contempt of Parliament by the Speaker for not providing information on costing of legislation. And at that time, and I'm not saying that to be partisan, but I'm saying that I have some history on this in terms of understanding, and it's not just that government. Governments tend to be covetous about information, and that's why we have to not just seek to change a culture, but also change the legislative framework, the rules, and update the legislations that there's basically there's some hard ground from which all governments will operate. This should not be, and I go back to this, should not be partisan. What frustrated me at that time was that some of the members of the committee or some of the members of Parliament, the members of the committee who were part of at that time, the governing party, didn't seem to realize at that time that, in fact, when the government's not providing information to Parliament, it's denying not just opposition members, it's denying governing members the information they need to do their jobs. And that this is there's a basic constitutional and fiduciary responsibility for members of Parliament to hold government to account, particularly around budget measures and spending. One broader discussion we're reforming the estimates and budget processes to make it more transparent, and you've participated in an opening briefing on that. And there is, as we move forward, this is going to be important work as well in order to hold governments to account. But on that, so I mean, time will tell. You'll see. We're committed to implementing this agenda, and again, there will be challenges to it, but we're committed to implementing the agenda and moving forward with a more open and transparent approach.
Okay, thank you very much. We now are going to move to, we have three more colleagues, Mr. Generou, Ms. Murray, and Mr. Saini, I think had one quick question. And just a reminder to everybody, we actually have an adversarial system, and it's purposely designed that way, where we have the cut and thrust of debate and the good ideas bubble to the top to the benefit of all. Sometimes we get bogged down in the first one and we forget a little bit about the second one, and that's when things get partisan. But sure, this committee is not working that way. I can assure you, Mr. Minister, we're working on the second. We're still focused on that. So, Mr. Generou, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again, Minister. Although I appreciate a lot of the storytelling, reminiscing around here, like to get back to some of the task at hand, and again, hopefully you're not seeing it in a too partisan way, but if you'd be able to answer the questions a bit more directly would be appreciated. One final comment. I think your comments about moving too fast, it was our criticism of the process. I just want to be clear, that's not necessarily our criticism of the process, it's that moving unilaterally, not necessarily too fast. So that's, again, clarifying the record there. I want to get back to my previous question on the cabinet documents and then being open to the commissioners. You seem to be open to the idea of certain ones, but when it came to public safety, I think you indicated a number of times that that, of course, would be kept confidential. However, there's certain things that we've seen recently where aren't necessarily open, or would be beneficial to certain commissioners to be able to access that. You know, I will use the example of the Minister of Justice. Her husband works for an organization which lobbies her department. Currently, there's nothing the Ethics Commissioner can do in terms of the cabinet documents to ensure that that's not being abided to. hoping that you're open to removing some of these types of ethical screens in the cabinet document. So it's not just based on the public safety and privacy, which we're aware of, but also where we can be more understanding, as the ethics commissioner can be as well, as to that this is not being affecting her job or the compromising her department.
Yeah, not. We cooperate fully with the ethics commissioner, with Ms. Dawson's office, and you know, those of us who've been members of parliament before, you know, we all work with her on an ongoing basis in her office as ministers and previously as members of parliament, and we will continue to do so. I want to ensure she has.
The point is, though, is that she can't verify that you are cooperating, particularly when it comes to the Minister of Justice and her husband. It seems to be a direct conflict of interest, but the Ethics Commissioner doesn't not have access to the documents to be able to verify that. So that's where I'm hoping you'll be able to provide, again, a yes or no answer would be great, if that would be something that you'd be open to.
I'm absolutely open to providing a yes or no answer if you ask me a yes or no question. But this is you know, you're asking a pretty complex question, and it's my view and my understanding that all ministers of our government have engaged fully and honestly with the ethics commissioner and take very seriously her recommendations and any approach to ensure there's no conflict, and anything we can do to strengthen it, we're open to that. But our ministers have take that responsibility very seriously.
Yes, that's a roundabout yes, perhaps. Maybe just to frame it, if I can quickly, Chair. Yes or no, would you be open to the Ethics Commissioner having access to Cabinet confidential documents when it pertains to instances like the Justice Minister and her husband?
Well, even in Sweden's example, there are Cabinet confidences that are protected around certain measures. And for instance, a Justice Minister, just as an example, there are, in her work, she would have, a cabinet deals with whether it's security, public security, whether national security, financial policy, which is government or cabinet broadly, supervisory activities, public authorities. This is from Sweden, Mr. General. So what I'm saying
Well, we
is
have a specific example that pointing out with her husband being in conflict of interest with the Justice Minister. That's
actually, I believe, I'm not being argumentative, but I don't believe the commissioner has said that. In fact, I'm certain she hasn't said there's.
She can't verify it. That's the point. She can't verify it through the Cabinet confidential documents. You know all this, the Minister. I was hoping you get a yes or no answer. However, it doesn't seem you're open to that today.
I can assure you that the Minister of Justice is somebody of the highest ethical standard, and I feel very strongly about that.
We would love to verify that as well.
And that is consistent with the Ethics Commissioner's opinion that, in fact, there's not a conflict here.
I think we've exhausted
but I
this.
Appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. General. Ms. Murray, welcome to the committee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity to join in this discussion. And I wanted to talk a bit more about the culture of secrecy, because that seems to be a key thing that's come up at this committee. I acknowledge I'm here as a visitor, and so I haven't been part of your previous discussions. One of the members talked about information systems and just the difficulty, perhaps, of organizing information, and I just wanted to note, I think it was Mr. Massey, that the Auditor General's recent report of this week, in his remarks to Public Accounts Committee, that was certainly a theme, was the data is not being used effectively. So I think that is a challenge. But what I really wanted to I wanted to bring forward is the idea of risk aversion as being one of the bases for a culture of secrecy. So this is a long-term aspect of both on the political side, but I think also on the bureaucracy side, is risk aversion, and so I think that's directly connected. And so, Minister, you're working on public service renewal. And one of the things that you've talked about is that you want to get young people into the public service. And in terms of public service renewal, there's also been discussion about having a culture where it's okay to fail or to try something that doesn't work. And so I just wanted to ask you if you could, what your thoughts are in terms of how these things connect, the risk, enabling the public service to be able to take risks without there being terrible consequences, and then how that might connect with the idea of a culture of secrecy.
Thank you, Joyce. And Joyce and I first met when she was a cabinet minister in BC, and I was Minister of Public Works, and we were dealing with issues of shared services and between the federal and provincial government. That was back in around 2005, I believe, and brings with her that experience. We need to renew our public service. We have a first-class public service, but one of the things is the average age of new hires within the public service now is 37, which would seem ancient to Mr. Lightbound down there. It's important. You know, millennials represent the most digitally connected generation in the history of Canada, but also the most educated and informed, and you know, we need to find ways to attract them. One of the things that they want to know they can make a difference, and the only way you can make a difference is if you can try new things. But the problem is, you try new things, some of those things won't work out, and if you create a culture of fear in the public service that if you try something that fails, you're going to be in trouble, then it's that kind of cover your butt kind of culture that is anathema to innovation. And so we have to create a culture of intelligent risk-taking within the public service, enabling some level of entrepreneurialism within the public service. You know, some of you, Mr. Long's been an entrepreneur. I don't see any reason why the best instincts of entrepreneurs cannot be harnessed in government and in politics and in the public service. And so we want to do that. That's why I've been totally transparent this morning that as we do these things, we will err sometimes, and we will try something that doesn't work, or we may find that something we hadn't thought about makes a lot of sense, and we can hear from you and others. But we really want to do that, and within the public service, for young people who want to make a difference, public service still represents one of the best places to do it in the government, as a public servant, in politics, you know, and in opposition, and in government. And I can tell you, don't take for granted one moment the opportunity, the privilege you have to make a difference wherever you sit in the House of Commons. There is no bad seat in the House of Commons.
Agreed.
And there is no place from which you can't make a difference.
And committees do look better from the chair. That's for sure.
Pardon me?
And committees look a lot better from the perspective of the chair, I can tell you for the first time.
Okay,
So I'm kidding, of course. Thank you, Ms. Murray. We're going to move on quickly to Mr. Saini. You had, I think, just one question? Or
one question, yeah. One or two, depending on the time. The one question I have for you, Mr. Minister, is we're investing a lot of time and energy into coming up with a framework that we believe would satisfy government, the public. My only worry is how are we going to disseminate this information to the public, and how are we going to educate the public as to what we're doing, the rights and obligations, or the rights that they have, the obligations that we have. How do we disseminate this information so that the work that we've done here doesn't stay in a bubble or doesn't stay located to certain privileged access to certain institutions or people. How do you feel that the education rollout should happen? Should it happen from the commissioner? Should it happen from the government? Should it be a hybrid model? Like, I mean, all this work is being done for the benefit of Canadians. How do we make sure that they receive that benefit?
Well, that's a great question. It's one I actually have not thought of before. I mean, part of it will happen organically because when you make an announcement, of course, it gets carried. There will be stories on the news will carry on that. But you make a good point. To what extent should we proactively promote that these changes? And I'd be interested in the committee's view on that. The one thing about social media is that the ability to do that cost effectively is significant through social media, and we want to we do want to get the word out about these changes, that people are aware of them, and I would be interested in some. My initial thoughts would be some of it happens organically, but I think a proactive approach, particularly in terms of social media, making people aware of it and able to participate in it. Your point's quite good, making it so that people who may never have thought of seeking this information may actually think of it is important, as opposed to the people who think all the time about this and being the only group of people who are the stakeholders who are aware of it. It's a good point. I haven't thought it through, but maybe that could be part of your report, is how we could actually disseminate some of the information.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have just a minute left. If colleagues don't mind, I just have a quick question for you, Mr. Bryson, dealing with frivolous and vexatious requests. And part of this deals with an issue that I dealt with when I was a member of this committee years ago in a previous parliament, and it involves Mr. Drapeau, who was also a witness, where a Crown corporation, namely the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, would hide behind a clause in the journalistic integrity and not provide information that many people thought was sufficient. So frivolous and vexatious would always be in the would in my mind impugn the motives of the person who was asking the question, and I think we need to be very careful about these things. I don't disagree that it happens. Common sense would often tell you when something is being frivolous and vexatious, but how do we quantify that in language so that we give clear instructions and directions to those who would be administering those policies? But I would be curious if you, sir, had any thoughts on the recommendations from the Commissioner, who talked about having more access to information in our corporations, Crown corporations, and not necessarily directly government departments. I know she's got some recommendations there, and I think the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation would fit into that. Do you have any comments, sir?
Well, I think that any agency of government, whether it's department, agency, or Crown corporation, the transparency bus has left the station, and these changes that we make as a government in terms of overarching policy will affect every one and will have an impact. So I think that for all intents and purposes, the demands for more information from all agencies associated with the Crown will grow, and I don't think that you can't make these kinds of changes without it affecting Crown corporations at some level, and we will work with the Information Commissioner, and we will work with Crown agencies. That includes everything. That includes, for instance, port authorities, as an example, or airport authorities, or anywhere where you are managing public assets or expending tax dollars. There will be some level of, and anyone who says to me, the reasons, you better have some reasons, whether it's national security or privacy or something, and there are compelling reasons, let's be very clear, but they better be very compelling.
I agree. Thank you very much for that answer. Just as a matter of curiosity, There are 3 members of Parliament at this table today who were born after access to information. And, sir, you are going to be having a birthday in the very near future. I won't name the date, but I wish you many happy returns. I've calculated your age both on the Gregorian calendar and on the after light-bound calendar, and but I won't say what that number actually is, but we wish you a very happy birthday. We thank you so kindly for coming for a full 2 hours. And colleagues, thank you for your collegiality around the table today. This was most helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jennifer.